and thank you for joining us for today's webcast, Balancing Divergent Stakeholders for Optimal Solutions. My name is Bob Krisner, and I'm the chairman of the board for the National Association of Corporate Directors, the Three Rivers chapter. I'm also a retired KPMG partner and currently serve on the board of directors for Dollar Bank. First, I'd like to thank the NACD Three Rivers chapter's annual sponsors. We would not be here without their generosity and kindness, both prior to and throughout the pandemic. Programs like these are only possible because of them. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please contact Micah Whitfield. Sponsorships start as low as $3,000, and sponsors and members receive complimentary attendance to all regular in-person and virtual event programming like today's webcast. Today, our distinguished speaker is Alex Wolff, Board Director and Compensation Committee Chair for the Albemarle Corporation. He's also on the Board of Directors for two airline companies, JetSmart Holdings, which is a low-cost air carrier in South America, and Frontier Airlines, a U.S. low-cost air carrier. If you have any questions for Alex during the course of today's webcast, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom window to type in your questions, and he will try to answer as many of them as possible. So, to get us started, I'd like to first introduce today's moderator, Bill Hernandez. Bill is a retired vice president and CFO of PPG Industries and also one of our chapter directors. Bill, thank you for joining us today, and take it away. Just got to unmute, Bill.
All right, thanks, Bob. I appreciate the introduction. One of the things I'd like to add to your introduction of Alex, I first met Alex when he was on the board of Rockwood, a multi-billion-dollar chemical and lithium company, and I was on the board of Albemarle, a multi-billion-dollar chemical company, and both of us were looking at each other as possible acquisitions. And after in tune with our topic today, looking at all your different stakeholders, it made the most sense for Albemarle to acquire Rockwood. When we did so, we were so impressed with Alex, who at the time chaired the governance committee at Rockwood, that we asked him and two other of the Rockwood directors to join the Albemarle board. And we actually downsized our own board to accommodate them. And it was a great advantage to us to bring Alex on board. So Alex, thank you for agreeing to meet with us today.
Thanks, Bill. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great. Yeah, actually, I'd like to start off. You have a pretty interesting and varied background, and you've served on several different kinds of boards. And I know our audience, a lot of them are on some boards and some are seeking to go on boards. And one of the questions we often get is, how do you market yourself to be on a board? How do you get contacted by them? How do you seek them out? How do you decide which would be a good fit for you? How do you decide which would not be a good for you? What kind of due diligence should people do? So I would love to hear your opinion on all of that.
Great. Well, I come from a slightly different background than your typical board member, if such a thing exists, in that I did not emerged sort of from a career in business. My career was in the State Department, 34 years as a Foreign Service officer, traveling around the world, took positions in the United States and the like. So it's not something that to be frank, I was seeking or even anticipating. But it was an unexpected development that emerged for me as a result of having advised the CEO and chair of Rockwood, company you mentioned, on some challenges it was facing one of its overseas units. And the advice I had provided was slightly different than what their experts was providing, and I sort of gave my rationale why. And he, came away saying he had been impressed by that. And that led to an offer to join the Rockwood board. Again, something I had not anticipated, but as those of you listening who are searching for your first board, you can understand that the universal advice I received was to grab the opportunity. That board offers were rare and difficult to find, and particularly getting your first opportunity, which would be the highest hurdle. And that did prove true in my case, as some of the subsequent board opportunities that have been presented to me grew out of that very first board role. So my takeaway from this is that if you're seeking your first board seat, you probably should expect to be very flexible about the type of board you agree to serve on, and certainly more flexible than you might be for subsequent boards when you can be a little bit more selective. The reason I think is that no matter whether a public or private board, your first corporate board, regardless of industry or size, will really help provide the foundation to develop the skill sets you need, acquire new ones that will make you both a better board member and more competitive for future board seats. And that in turn will allow you to be much more selective in those boards that you may want to serve on in the future. So the process I typically go through in determining whether to join a board is first to have a clear understanding of why the board might want me to join. What skills and experiences do I bring that differentiate me? This helps better appreciate what the board is expecting of me if I were to join. And as part of my own diligence, I research as much as I can about the company as I would in any job opportunity. Were there any problems in the past that I need to know about that might be affecting the company today? Where is it headed? Where does it see itself in the coming years? Who are the executives and the current board members, and what positions have they held in the past, to get a sense of the background, the skills that currently exist in the company. I try also to seek out individuals who may have worked with the company previously, former executives, and wherever possible, former board members. And that helps you really get a sense for the culture and the sorts of things that may not be immediately obvious when you're doing an interview or reading through the public disclosures. And also very important is, you really need to determine what time commitments are expected and necessary for you to devote to this board to ensure that you can be both fully prepared and a constructive contributing member on the company. Nothing worse than joining a board and determining after the fact that it was a mistake, and that can lead to a very unhappy experience. So as much as you can do in the lead up to understand what you're getting into, why people expect you to be contributing and how they expect you to be contributing, and whether your own sense of what you can bring to that board in terms of the value added will really help guide you both in the decision and to ensure you're an effective member.
Well, it's interesting, based on those answers, when I was on the governance committee at Albemarle, you came to us and said you've been approached by Pacific Gas and Electric to join the board and you wanted to join the board. And for those of you who may not remember, that was right at the height when they were on the front page of every newspaper, it seemed, almost every day, due to the wildfires in California. They're blamed for setting those wildfires based on faulty equipment, the rolling outages they're having, the hatred that seemed that was being espoused to them by community groups, by local and state governments, stakeholders, debt holders, shareholders, everybody screaming for blood. And in the midst of all that, you came to us and asked, could you join that board? And we all kind of questioned your sanity. Maybe you can explain why you chose to go on that board? And also, really, how did the board then address that myriad of concerns in a balanced way that gave the best possible outcome for as many people as possible?
I'm smiling, Bill, because in retrospect, maybe I should have listened to you harder. No, seriously, as I described, whereas my first board opportunity grew out of an interaction with the board chair of a company, the PG&E opportunity developed when I was approached by a group of shareholders in the company, which had already gone into bankruptcy. And that group was putting together a completely new board slate as part of an effort to have the company emerge from bankruptcy against the backdrop of a very contentious environment, including at the time a contending slate of directors being put forward by another group of investors. What attracted me to the idea was, first of all, after doing a bit of the research, I did see a fit between the complex needs and issues that the company was facing, especially in its interaction with the state's political and regulatory authorities, and my own background and skill sets, and something that I thought I could bring to the table. I also knew, and this did prove to be absolutely right, that this would be a tremendous learning opportunity for me that would broaden my knowledge and experience, both of a completely new sector, the utility sector, and as important, the restructuring process of a company that had gone through a Chapter 11 process, not because of any financial distress at the time, but to protect itself from huge liabilities and claims. The company was still generating about $13 billion a year in revenue, so a healthy, flow. Finally, I did recognize that this would be a transitional board with a specific task focused on all of those issues associated with the restructuring and emergence from bankruptcy, and not necessarily the type of long-term commitment one would make when joining a more traditional board situation. So for all of those reasons, I thought, again, not coming out of the business world, these would be skills that I would be learning firsthand in sort of a master class, so to speak, in a way that I could bring those with me in the future to all the other boards that I was sitting on or would be sitting on. So once the board came together, we quickly understood that our fiduciary role and responsibilities in a bankruptcy process, in the case of PG&E, had to balance numerous contending interests and demands of a wide variety of stakeholders. And these included, obviously, stockholders, bondholders, employees who were very concerned about their future, customers who were worried about their rates given the costs of energy already in California, the regulatory authorities who were overseeing PG&E, judicial authorities. This was a company that was under probation for felonies committed years earlier in a gas explosion, unions, among many others, and most particularly the victims of the fire for which PG&E was deemed responsible, who had extensive claims before the courts against the company. So we approached this task strategically with clear objectives in mind, including in particular the need to guide the company in a way so we would emerge from bankruptcy in a manner that maximized the long-term prospects of the company and as many of its stakeholders as possible. And this was a classic case, as you could imagine, where no one group was particularly happy with the result, but overall, it ended up being the result that best served the interests probably of all the stakeholders collectively.
How united was the board on those kinds of issues and questions?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
How united was the board in addressing those kinds of questions? Was there a lot of dissent among the board members, or did you reach consensus fairly easily?
It was a divided board. Bear in mind, and this is an interesting, case study, in the fact that this is not a board where I joined that already had sitting board members and a culture that was established and a history. This was essentially, except for two, I believe, individuals, all brand new board members coming from completely different backgrounds, experiences, and approaches and perspectives. So we had to develop very early on a sense of what our task was, what was the ultimate strategy in play, and what were our priorities. There was no agreement even on what priorities we needed to focus on. So we spent some time early on just absorbing as much as we could to learn about the company, to learn about the bankruptcy case, to learn about the stakeholders who were fighting each other and have different approaches, and to determine what it was that we needed to do for the company and its employees, its customers, and its shareholders to ensure it remained viable in the future. And that helped narrow down sort of 2 or 3 primary objectives, and and to simplify them and give you a good sense of what it was. We knew that in year 1, the one absolute thing we could not afford to have happen was another fire for which PG&E would be deemed responsible. That would be an existential challenge to the company from which it would not have survived. So focusing on safety, focusing on all of the issues required to minimize the chance that would happen would give us the time. So we, in a sense, that bought us time to deal with the very complex bankruptcy proceedings. So that became the second priority, because we needed to emerge from bankruptcy in a given period of time, because the state and the regulators were very uneasy about this process. They wanted to see the settlement with the victims take place because it was a political issue for them as well that this was dragging on. As you mentioned, Bill, it was on front pages of newspapers daily. So we had a sense in the back of our mind of needing to resolve the bankruptcy issue within a year or so, or again, the state. There was a possibility the state could step in ways that would have taken the company away from its shareholders. So that helped focus the mind. Then on the specific issues, we also had the task. We had to find a new CEO, which came on board with the new board at the same time. We changed advisors. We had an exodus of some executives. We had to fill in behind them. So it was, a real fire drill in this regard, nonstop. The amount of time we were devoting to board meetings, I think we were meeting, at least weekly. When you added committee meetings, twice a week for many of us on board activity. We had to travel to San Francisco. We made efforts to meet with as many of the stakeholders as we could. We had, you can imagine, I don't know, when we were looking at one point to hire a law firm to do some specific task for us, I recall we couldn't find one because almost every law firm had already been engaged in one way or another on behalf of the company or somebody suing the company. So because of conflicts of interest, there were no law firms available. It was really, really wild. And so but you're absolutely right. Building some sort of consensus among both a diverse board and a board with different views as to what needed to be done, and the time frame from doing each involved a lot of time at the beginning.
So it sounds like you came up the best possible solution, but not everybody was happy with what your final answers were on these issues. Any group that was the most recalcitrant in trying to get on board? Any one of the stakeholders?
Well, I would view all of the stakeholders having an interest in maximizing their own individual situation to the extent possible. So as you go through a negotiation, and this I know from my own government experience, the positions that people stake out are not necessarily the positions they can live with. And so until you got to a situation where it was sort of becoming clear what a solution might look like, that's when the real positions started to emerge. So throughout the process, everyone was recalcitrant. Everyone was, a problem. And when solutions started to form and it became clear that this was the way we were going to be proceeding, people slowly started to fall into place. But I'll give you a good example. The other one, the unions. The unions were looking at a group of stockholders on the one side and a group of bondholders on the other side, who were classic contenders in situations such as this one, where you have a bankruptcy and a restructuring process, because a solution could enrich or impoverish one or the other. The union sat back and was basically looking who was going to offer them the best deal.
Alex, one of the questions that I'm getting here is, were there some stakeholders that were more important than others in your decision?
Yes, in the sense that those with a major stake, without which a solution would be impossible, by definition were the most important. Among those, I would include the victims. If you did not address the victims' claims and resolve the victims' demands and needs, and by victims, I mean both the individuals and the communities affected by the fire, there would have been no solution, because the governor would not have supported it, the legislature would not have supported it, and through them, the regulatory body would not have supported the solution. So getting victims on board, and that means they're representatives, in a number of cases, very scrappy tort lawyers, who had a huge financial stake in what the final restitution to the victims would be. They were critical.
Alex, I can tell you've come out of the State Department. Scrappy tort lawyers is an interesting way of describing them.
Well, I think you all know what I mean.
Yes, we do. But I'd like
the
to follow
others,
up on that.
would be then, the other two, I would say, we had the shareholders in the company, of course, and the bondholders were an important constituency. And so to the extent you could resolve their contending needs, once you had victims, bondholders, and shareholders on board, you still had some others who may or may not have been happy, but most other people saw a path to a solution that way, including the regulators and the governor's office. So I would say those were critical. There were others that were important and key, but without any of those three, we would not have had a solution.
And mention your background, the State Department. Did that background help you at all in this process? Anything you learned, anything comparable that you had to address in the State Department to those kind of concerns?
Yeah, my background, I think, did help, and there were a lot of experiences, and I would cite in particular my experience at the United Nations, where we had to deal, on behalf of the United States with 191 other countries. And so there were some similarities in the PG&E process in the following sense. First of all, when you're working in government, and particularly in international relations, you become accustomed to the fact that you often are not going to be able to solve an issue definitively, and that success is best defined by how you manage a problem over time, rather than whether you can definitively resolve a problem once and for all. So take the Middle East. There's no solution to the Middle East. You want to avoid conflict or deterioration. And when you're dealing with multiple stakeholders on an issue over which you have limited ability to influence. So, in the case of PG&E, the main point was, as I said, we wanted to avoid a situation where the company would be the cause of future wildfires and the liability that could result. And there's no way to guarantee that. Just read the paper today. Given the drought and the climate situation in California, wildfires are going to occur. Will equipment from the company be affected? The equipment of the company is all over the place. If you get a tree branch that is whipped by 80-mile-an-hour winds and flown for half a mile and lands on your equipment, and then creates a spark, and is that the fault of the company? Is it not the fault of the company? All of these things are impossible to resolve. So you have to basically approach this in a way that, how do you establish and develop a framework and the mechanisms to deal with this problem over time, to minimize the risk, to deal with the issue of liability, to get other stakeholders and other parties that have some role in this, CAL FIRE, the government communities, in terms of building codes and things like that, all of which can contribute to diminishing the risk of having a massive wildfire and casualties from it. So in sum, dealing with ambiguity, dealing with uncertainty, and dealing with continuing risk, and the fact that there is no solution that's going to make this go away, that's going to say PG&E will never have to face this again, California will never have to face this again in one way or another. So how do you build in the safeguards, et cetera? And for some, for me, that's sort of something I'm very comfortable with, that degree of ambiguity. For others who are used to some more black and white approach, and let's solve this, let's once and for all, let's make clear who is responsible for this and who's responsible for that. That was much more difficult. And I would add, the final point is there was a huge overlay of political interests here because of the oversight from the governor's office and the legislature, since their constituents were mostly affected, and they had a role in terms of the Public Utilities Commission of California, a governmental entity, in these issues as well. So this resembled a lot the experiences I had at the United Nations, where you're trying to maximize, where each party is trying to maximize its own position at the expense of others, but you have to find a compromise that is minimally acceptable to as many as possible. And that can satisfy a critical mass of stakeholders. And the last point, where I thought there was a lot of similarities, is like in diplomacy and government work, you need to invest time to develop allies and to build coalitions, and not only deal with them when you have to come to them with a request, and when you need them for their support. So I met with, and other board members met with, victims who had suffered from the fires, community leaders, legislative and government officials. We attended judicial hearings. We visited with employees. We saw the sites that were affected. All of these things help both to understand better what our various constituencies were, but also to formulate better the approaches that we knew could be better accepted and understood by each of the stakeholders. And since they knew us and had a face and name to put to the abstract notion of the board and the company, and that we had listened to them and heard their concerns, there was a greater degree of trust, I guess, that we understood what their concerns and needs were, and had taken those into account.
You used the term I really liked when you said you manage, not resolve an issue, and that I think that's a very, very good way of describing the situation you were in. One of the questions that has come in, and I think you answered it partially, it's come in, is, was it easy for the board to agree on priorities, or did you have very different stands taken by board members?
We had different stances taken by board members, and it's the only board I've served on to date where a lot of decisions were not fully by consensus, that there were votes. And with some board members, one occasion myself, disagreeing, but what we tried to ensure was that the process, the decision-making process, was such that whatever the decision was, and whether it was consensual or not, that the board could rally around it and move on from there in a unified manner, and that we were able to achieve. And frankly, given the issues at play and both the complexities and the stakes and the risks, I felt better, frankly, that it was not ever always by consensus, because there were very strong arguments in both directions on a number of issues. And the fact that people were able to present their views candidly and stand by them made me feel more comfortable, that I understood better what the pros and cons of every decision we were taking.
One of the other questions that's come in, it said some of the risks you described, it sounded kind of equivalent to what some companies are facing with cyber risks today.
Yes, except I would say that in the case of the cyber risk, the most stakeholders are aligned in terms of understanding what the risks to the company are and what the challenges the company is facing and what steps the company might need to take. There may be differences of view of whether you pay ransom or if you how you deal with it once you're confronted by a cyber risk. But no, I think what's came forward clearly to me in the case of PG&E, which is something that I'd experienced in government as well, is that the more imminent the risk and danger to a company, the more likely you're going to have disagreements, and the more likely that there, civility will erode a little bit, because people immediately have before them a very, very clear challenge. It's imminent. There's an expectation you need to deal with it, and you need to tackle this issue. And depending on what your perspective is, what your how you see the company's priorities, what approach you deem most prudent and reasonable, there's likely to be disagreement. But my guess is in the case of cyber threats, it's probably easier for stakeholders and board members to coalesce around a position than others, because if you are have faced or are facing a risk of disruption because of that threat, everyone loses. And so you are aligned in trying to ensure that you do whatever you can to both prevent a crisis and make sure you're prepared to deal with a crisis if it occurs.
When this all was going on, did any question came in, did any activists get involved that you had to deal with? Separate from the other constituents you had to deal with? Did anybody get involved in the stock as the process was going on?
There were a lot of short sellers, as you could imagine, depending on any given week where the negotiation was, who was leaking what to the press. There were wild gyrations in the share price, people betting on whether bondholders would prevail, whether stockholders would prevail, whether the company would prevail, whether the government would prevail, all of these things. So in a sense, it was a permanent activist environment. And I approached this, frankly, with the view that I was an activist and that this board was an activist, that the company needed a serious review. As I said, a company that was on probation already for felony acts. a company that was deemed to be responsible for the death of some 82 people, billions of dollars in property damage. Something was wrong. And so my mentality as a board member is that I was an activist and needed to ensure the company was shaken up and reformed in a way that these activities, behaviors, these challenges would not exist in the future.
I'd like to switch gears a little bit. From Pacific Gas and Electric actually to Rockwood. Now, at the time, you all came to a consensus. I wasn't in part of your discussions. I was in my own discussions at Albemarle, but you came up with a decision that it was best for your stakeholders to allow yourselves to be acquired by Albemarle. And I know earlier on, you guys had talked among yourselves about trying to make a run at us, to buy us. So I'm just wondering, maybe you can share with us how you decided it was best for your stakeholders to be sold to Albemarle, and how did you come to that conclusion? What were the discussions? Were there any dissenters in that process at Rockwood? When you approached us with buying us, it was a resounding no. We weren't going to be acquired by Rockwood in our discussions, and we looked at you as a viable acquisition. But just kind of curious, how did things go on your side of the fence?
So that was a very interesting process. Probably useful to just provide a little bit of background on Rockwood. Rockwood was sort of like a holding company with 6 or 7 discrete business segments that had grown from a private equity play to a publicly held company. So over the course of several years, this predated my joining the board, investors had already been urging the company to streamline more, believing that that was the best path to create more shareholder value. And so the company had been sort of steadily divesting itself of ancillary businesses until a basic core remained of lithium operations and the surface treatment specialty chemicals business. And once we were slimmed down on these, primarily these 2 operations, we also became aware of interest from other companies in acquiring Rockwood. And so this is a situation where your bankers and advisors, keeping their ears to the ground and the like, note that there's talk. And so after having several sort of strategic conversations, it was clear that it was either be acquired or acquire. We needed to grow and do something that would take us to the next level, or we were likely to be an attractive target for others. As you noted, we looked at testing the waters to acquire Albemarle. I believe it was in the fall of 2013. And Albemarle seemed to us like a very natural fit. It also had primarily 2 business elements. One was bromine, and bromine and lithium were similar in terms of how you obtain the resource from brine deposits. In the case of bromine in Jordan, in the case of Rockwood, we had brine deposits in Chile. And then you had catalysts, and we had the specialty chemical surface treatment business. There were similarities in those as well. So we thought it would be a good symbiosis between the 2 companies, and made an approach to Albemarle. I think it was Albemarle, again, we rejected and in turn proposed acquiring Rockwood in the spring of 2014, that time frame. Now, coincidentally, and this is an important point in our own deliberations, and I think in our shareholder perspectives, our CEO was someone who was very closely associated with the success of the company. Had been with that company since its private equity days, and was deemed to be someone who was, largely responsible for having taken the company forward, both public and then in a success as a public company. So he enjoyed tremendous shareholder support as an individual. He himself had become the leading candidate to succeed the CEO at another company. So all this coming together, many shareholders who had been invested in Rockwood in large part because of their confidence in the CEO, saw that the CEO, when that was announced, would be leaving the company, looked at their own investment in the company and recognized they had a fairly low basis in their investment compared to the offer that Albemarle had made for the company. And there was general agreement that this would be very, very good for the company and for its shareholders. I think there may have been one or two minor shareholders who thought we might be selling too soon. We could have developed a little bit more as a company. But my sense is that when news emerged that the CEO would no longer be part of Rockwood, that they recognized it wasn't going to be the same company, and therefore the best next step would be to agree to be acquired by Albemarle. And then we also discussed the social issues. You mentioned, Bill, Albemarle generously took on 3 board members from Rockwood. And I would note that, in addition to myself today, one of those ex-Rockwood members is the CEO and chair of Albemarle. So it was a great synergistic exercise that I think both from a cultural and social level, from a business level, made immense sense and went through very smoothly. And lastly, in terms of the other stakeholders, I don't think customers were that concerned, primarily because lithium and surface treatment were standalone entities. So there was nothing, special that they would be losing. Employees, of course, there's mixed results. It's negative for the local community where Rockwood was headquartered, for local, both in terms of employment and as a tax base, but it's positive for the new communities where the merged company would eventually be relocated and be hiring. So, but in general, this was a fairly smooth process. Everyone saw the wisdom and the value behind it. And I think when you look at what Albemarle looks like today, it clearly benefited both companies.
And additional comment in terms of bringing on the 3 board members, as we looked at it, and as used the word symbiosis, and there was a lot of symbiotic ability with us putting the 2 companies together. But one of the discussions we had was wanting to bring on board members and knowing we had to downsize and getting a consensus on our own board on, and every one of us was saying we're willing to go and put our names forward and making it a decision for the full board on who would then retire from our board to bring your 3 board members on. So I think on our side, there was great consensus as well on the acquisition at that point in time. A little different than your PG and the experience on the shoes. But now that you are on the Albemarle board, one of the things I'd like to talk about, and you mentioned a little bit about geographically where they are, but Albemarle is very heavily invested in Jordan, in the Middle East. A lot of operations in China. Like I said, Chile is extremely important. Chile historically, I think, has been one of the best democracies that we could expect in Latin America, though they're hitting a few bumps here and there. And what advice do you have for any of our audience who are on companies that are thinking about doing business globally or internationally what considerations and risks should they think through? And I'm sure you guys have continual discussions on the political risks of doing business in China and Chile and Jordan and the other countries that you're exposed to. So any comments you have on those areas would be very helpful.
Sure. You rightly indicated that there are very, very different sets of risks and issues associated with running operations in other countries outside the United States. So, imagine all of the issues one is familiar with in the United States in terms of risk, and political risk, regulatory risk. Just look at what happened now with Keystone Pipeline, things that you made the wrong bet on that one. The way our politics are, these things are becoming more acute in the sense of, now depending on which party gets in, you may, all your assumptions may go out the window. It didn't necessarily used to be that way. So, magnify that tenfold and you have a starting of an understanding of what it's like to deal now with this overseas. So you need to avoid looking through the prism of how we do things in the US when we're looking at expanding overseas. Because the regulatory, the political, the cultural, the economic, and social backdrops will be very, very different. So aside from the obvious elements involved when you consider such a step, your base exchange rate risks, have local tax burden issues. There are a number of many more abstract risks that you have to be prepared for. Excuse me. So first, you need to recognize that you will depending on where you go, that you may be almost completely dependent on local expertise, whether it's your own employee base or local advisors to help guide your decisions, because you're in an area, in a locale, a geography that may be very, very different. And that's hard to learn about. They may be speaking a completely different language. They may have a completely different alphabet system, so it's even harder to read and try to sort through. So the sort of comfort one has in being able to do your own due diligence and do your own research when you're with an American company dealing in the United States, much more difficult when you're doing that as a board member for a company in a country where they speak a different language, they have different backgrounds, and their political system may be quite different. Second, you generally will not have the same degree of transparency that exists in the US, except for a few exceptions in Western Europe. The sense that everything is on the table and everything is disclosed and there are penalties for not having things disclosed tends to be very different overseas. Third, as you can imagine, particularly in smaller countries or countries that lack strong democratic institutions, there may be outside influences that will exert influence on local authorities that can affect your interests in a way that would not occur the same in the United States. Competitors, people who are eyeing the business that you are eyeing, and they may be a constant thorn in your side, particularly if they have an in with the local government. Again, the better the more established, the more resilient the institutions are in a given country, the less this is likely. But in a number of countries, particularly in the developing world, where a lot of these resources exist, this is another issue that you have to deal with. Fourth, obviously, there's the issue of political and other types of instability, both inside the country and in the region. Because if there's instability in the region, that can spill over both in terms of conflict, refugee flows, other stresses on the company that create new and potentially enormous risks to your own operations. You could imagine having a mine in a border area that's in dispute. Doesn't occur when you're on the border between states in the United States. So these sorts of issues require a lot of careful thought your whole investment might be in jeopardy and at stake. The judicial system, how objective, how clean is it? Can you rely on it? If not, again, those outside forces are going to utilize that potentially against you. And fifth, your own legal liabilities, both as a corporate entity and as executives and board members, may be quite different. In some countries, you risk personal, financial, and criminal penalties for decisions you take, for which you would be protected in the US under our duty of care and loyalty concepts that don't necessarily exist. And these may be for some rather anodyne steps like downsizing, because you let people go. And in some governments, that's illegal. You can't do it. So you need to do your homework, both and to decide both whether and where you want to operate. And once you've made that decision, how you operate overseas, how directly involved in, are you going to have, bring people from outside to oversee it? Are you going to hire everyone locally? The balance between local advisors and American advisors. And the last point I would make, if you sort of absorb the daunting nature of everything I've described, I think it really is indispensable to have executives on your team and ideally board members with some experience with this, to ensure you're asking the right questions, that you can be well-informed enough, that you're challenging your advisors who may have their own interests in the conclusions they present to you. So to make those considered decisions and factor in all of the upside and downside. This is another good example we were describing with PG&E. In a lot of these situations, you probably need to be prepared to live with a greater degree of risk, greater risk tolerance than you would be operating in an environment in which you're comfortable, in which there are greater safeguards, and which there are more checks and balances than in operations overseas.
One of the things that go along with higher risks or higher returns, commensurate with the risks, do you perceive it the same way, that you need to demand higher returns from those foreign investments?
I think that is true. The problem is always is, what you think will give you a higher return today may be, less likely in the future, and vice versa. Things that you think are, high risk and not worth going into, in the future may well be worth it. So the risk premium in these environments, I think, is higher. I think that's recognized. This doesn't obviously negate the need to do thorough diligence on the economics of the operation. And there are additional challenges there with the lack of long-term predictability, particularly if you're in an unstable environment. Fortunately, in the case of Albemarle, the countries you've described in the regions in which they operate are the most stable, among the most stable. But that doesn't buy you any guarantees. And again, imagine being a foreign company investing in the United States these days. There's uncertainties that maybe 10 years ago would have been unthinkable. But so you have to be prepared for that, live with it, and and the returns should reflect that.
One of the unique things I think some of the investments Albemarle has, maybe then you can go deal globally because you want to look at the foreign country as a market for a manufacturing process. But a lot of what you do, the assets are in the ground. In Chile for lithium, in Jordan for bromine. Those are important assets to the countries you're dealing with. Does that add another layer of complexity or concern, that they make sure that they extract the appropriate returns from a foreign entity coming in and trying to operate in their backyard?
Absolutely. You've hit a very, very important topic. And that's one of the issues that I think you need to spend a lot of time on if you're operating those environments. These are for Jordan, bromine is a primary source of revenue. It's a finite resource. It's a shared resource in the Dead Sea with Israel, and all of the complexities that brings to bear. It is one. The bromine sector, not Albemarle itself, because the Jordanians have their own operations there as well. It's a major employer, so there's pressure also on who you're employing. All of these things are constant things to track. And again, if there's a change in government, particularly the ideology of a government, you can imagine that raises all sorts of issues as well. What works in one's favor, however, is to the extent that you are dealing with government and your arrangements, your concessions, your contracts, your ownership, your taxation is negotiated with and agreed with by government. All governments have an interest in demonstrating to foreign investors that they are worthy of that investment, and particularly a future investment, and not just in that sector. So they will try to avoid to give the country a reputation for being erratic or unreliable or acting unlawfully. So the fact that you have agreements with governments, even though they may lapse after some years, or there may be political pressure to renegotiate them, gives you some sort of security that the costs of them reneging, revoking a concession, unlawfully nationalizing your operations, the costs of those go well beyond your own company and that specific industry. They affect that government's reputation across the board. And since many of these governments crave foreign investment, need it to develop their resources and help them through that tax base develop their populations, they are very cautious about, or at least have the incentive to be very cautious. It doesn't give you a 100% guarantee, but it's one positive element. But the risk is there, and particularly for countries where you're operating and extracting the one resource that they have, and if it's not plentiful and if it's finite, people are going to be paying careful attention and giving very, very close scrutiny to how you're developing that resource and whether you're doing it in the best possible way for the communities in which you're operating, the country as a whole, and then the industry. So again, many more layers and levels of considerations that need constant attention and care, need to be managed.
Yep. One comment and one question that popped up. One is, dealing both internationally. One is, here in the U.S., we're a lot of focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, in your experience, how is this being addressed by companies outside the United States, or companies like yours with assets and operations outside of the United States?
Well, we view this sort of holistically from the company's perspective, but obviously there are different elements of this issue in the United States versus overseas. First, the obvious thing is, the composition, the demographic and educational and professional composition of the workforce in many overseas locations, particularly in smaller countries, this is even greater case, tend to be less diverse and more homogeneous than they are in the United States. Secondly, you probably don't have the same legal overlay and governance overlays overseas that you might have in the United States or Western Europe or other countries. Third, you probably don't have the particular social issues and backdrop to these issues in other countries, or you may have different ones in other countries than you have in the United States. So when you take a country like Jordan, it's a very homogeneous country in that regard. The population is Bedouin and Arab, essentially, and Palestinian. In Chile, it's Chilean with some indigenous component. Australia has its own demographics. China is a very homogeneous country. So these are not countries that either demand, expect, or have opportunities from the local workforce for diversity. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It exists everywhere, obviously, particularly in terms of background and training and skills. But that doesn't mean that from your executive standpoint, the people you send to these locations and that you put in positions of authority to run your operations, that reflects more what you're doing internally here in your headquarters to develop a diverse team and to give everyone an opportunity to rise in the organization and have equal opportunities to advance and potentially move up the ladder. So exposure to your operations in these locations, opportunities to manage these operations are part of that diversity effort that we make as a company, although the circumstances in each locale may differ.
Great. One of the comments somebody made is that working in multiple geographies, trying to harvest best practices in different pockets and replicate it in other pockets. Have you found that in your experience? That's a useful approach?
Yes, it's a very good question. I think it is in terms of more of the strategic oversight and management aspects. So you should always be asking the same type of questions everywhere. What is the judicial system like? What are the risks if a different party comes into play? All of those, you can have sort of a template of those sorts of questions that constantly need to be asked. In terms of best practices in each country, the more similar these countries are in terms of their structures, whether they're economic or political, or regulatory, the easier it is to replicate. But operating in China is very different than from operating in New Zealand. Operating in Mexico is very different from operating in Nigeria. So while there are similarities in the sorts of oversight functions a board would be expected to undertake, the actual operations and the best practices tend to work better where countries are more similar and tend to give you a foundation from which to build and fine tune and tweak to adapt to the local circumstances. So again, very different from the United States, where if you have an approach that works in Oregon, it's probably going to be an approach that works pretty well in North Dakota.
Great. I asked you earlier about commensurate risk and reward in different countries, and somebody asked the question, this goes back to the PG&E part. Do you feel that the board members' remuneration was adjusted to reflect the risks and other factors that you had there?
That's a simple answer, no. You say this half in jest, but I'll give you some examples why. When you look at it from, like any other calculation, as the amount of time you put into this and what your remuneration is, it was probably the worst financial decision I made. When you look at it from what I learned and how I developed as a board member and the experiences that I went through that can make me a better board member in other companies, that was invaluable. We went into this, and I'll give you one anecdote. We went into this as a company being, told by, all stakeholders, you ought to look at the compensation, and we would all be supportive of the board increasing its compensation given what it was going to have to deal with. And we as a board concluded, I was one of the ones noting this, politically, it would have been a disaster. You've got unresolved claims for people who've lost lives and property. You've got communities that are suffering. You've got, judicial investigations. You've got liabilities and claims that are enormous. And we come in as a board, and the first thing we do is raise our compensation. It would have been, personally from a reputational standpoint, I think in terms of the confidence in the board and the sense that we had our priorities in order, we would have suffered. So, and the board quickly came to appreciate, we all recognized we were not being compensated in a manner commensurate with the work, time, and effort we were making, but that seeking greater compensation would have been a mistake.
As an aside, years ago, boards used to pay their board members for each board meeting they attended, for each committee meeting they attended. And I was always anti that. I said, you're expected to show up for everything. You get paid a flat amount, and you shouldn't join a board if compensation is your primary objective anyways. It's for, like you said, the learning process, a synergistic effect that you're helping them, they're helping you, you're partaking of your knowledge. And then, so I did away when I joined the Kodak board with those kind of fees. And then we went into bankruptcy, and I ran the restructuring. And I told my wife, on an hourly basis, I would make more money working for my daughter's Chick-fil-A than I am doing this. So yeah, that's it. When a board does seem to get in trouble, there is no remuneration, I think, that you could say really is paying for the work on it. But again, that's not the reason I think you do it.
I would add, Bill, and to the person who raised the question, I was thinking through this as well as you were speaking, it reminded me that one other point that I didn't raise is, and mention, particularly for those who are thinking about board membership and how to enhance the prospect of getting offers for future boards. The networking, the exposure I received, and the people I met through this process who I wouldn't have met otherwise, both from the investment side, some of the contending parties, et cetera, who appreciated what we were doing. This created a whole new network of individuals on whose radar I now appear, and who in the future may be interested in seeking me out. So knowing everything I know, and believe me, it was a very painful year doing this. If I had to do it over again, I would do it over again.
Yeah, great. One question I had for you is the difference between companies. That some companies have very short-term focuses. They're worried about quarterly earnings the next quarter, and that seems to be extremely important to them. But you're involved with a company, Lithium, that is a long-term play. It's a very long-term play. It's a lot of thoughts has to go into the process of where are we going with energy needs, with storage and battery needs. What is the way it's going to be manufactured? What is the research and development going into that, and in the downstream operations, the restrictions and fighting for scarce resource. What's the role of the board in something that is such a long-term process in deciding what options are the best to pursue or to cut off? And how do you balance those inherent risks to the company's benefit?
This goes to the heart, in my opinion, of what a board needs to do, and that is help develop and implement and maintain a strategic view and approach of the company you're serving. And in this regard, although the particularities of a lithium company are exactly what you described, Bill, generally speaking, it's not unique to lithium or other companies that have this sort of long-term play. Most companies have used, as you've described, face both short-term and long-term challenges. If you don't have a long-term approach and strategy and vision of where you're headed, which looks different from where you are today, probably doing something wrong, because externalities, other developments, technology, other dislocations and the like are going to change the world in ways that are going to make the business model you have now obsolete. And then if you're standing still, also your own competitors may be actually moving in on you. So this balance between short-term and long-term challenges is a perennial tension, I think, for a board. In the case of a lithium company, as you can imagine, there's a great degree of patience that has to be exercised until all the stars align. This is still, a negligible component of energy, particularly in the electric vehicle component. That's going to take a long time to come to fruition. There's very promising signs, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. But this is clearly a very long-term play. And so the board needs to balance all of the short-term needs and challenges that all companies face with keeping their eye on the ball and where are we headed and adjusting where necessary. My sense is that management teams are also doing both, but the stress on management teams tends to be pulling them toward the short term. They've got to run the company on a day-to-day basis. They've got to ensure that the next year's supply is assured for. They've got to ensure that the next year's clients are contracted for, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then there's the quarterly reports, earnings statements, pressure from shareholders, or others looking at you. All of these things require almost full-time attention. So the management team still makes time for and keeps as its North Star the overriding strategy of the company into the long term. But that's where I think the board needs to constantly play a role in challenging and helping prioritize decision, helping make clear that decisions you're taking today fit into that long-term strategy, even if they don't naturally appear to in the first instance, and to help prioritize. There's lots of things that may appear very attractive for short-term needs to a management team that make a lot of sense, but cost you the opportunity to do something else that positions you even better a few years down the line. Some instances that may be the right answer. Some instances it may not be the right answer, but the board needs to be constantly on top of this, both to ensure that the direction the company is headed is consistent with the strategy that's been set, that the investments reflect that, but at the same time, not making the short-term errors or missing the short-term opportunities that could ultimately render the long-term play moot. So like I said, in the case of PG&E, we knew what the long-term needs were, but if we didn't get the short-term right, there was going to be no long-term.
One of the questions that came in, there's that old adage about a board oversight is, keep your nose in and your fingers and your hands out. But based on your experiences, what instances is it where the board needs to be more involved in operations than you would typically see? And I think you obviously dealt with some of them, but how would you look at that? When does the board need to get more involved than it normally would?
I will answer that, in my experience generally with a hypothetical, because I've not experienced it. Is I could imagine where you have shortfalls in a management team that require at least greater role of the board to make sure you're getting the right decision made. Ultimately, this will result in changing the management team. That may be one of the issues. But if you don't have the luxury of moving very quickly, the board may need to get involved on that. The case of PG&E, the board was very much involved. And I have to tell you, that's a very unhappy situation for a board to be in. It creates strains and stress with management. It takes time away from the strategic work you're supposed to be doing. It creates other strains among board members as to what the right approach is. So if if you as a board are engaged directly in these sorts of management decisions or day-to-day running of the company, chances are you've got a dysfunctional company and management team, and you need to start looking at that and resolving that. It's not. I do believe in that adage. To the extent you can keep your fingers out. If you've got the right team in place, you shouldn't have to put your fingers in. There are going to be situations, of course, illnesses, departures, things like that, where board may need to step in very short term. But as a general proposition, it's something that should be avoided. It's getting the rules done wrong, and if you're involved, again, doing things that management should be doing, you're not doing what the board should be doing.
Okay, I think we're hitting near the end of our time, so I'm just gonna ask you one last question. You've chaired different committees. Like I said, Rockwood, you chaired the governance committee. I know you're chairing the compensation committee at Albemarle. Any advice for our audience on if they join a board, what kind of committees should they try and gravitate towards? I know it always comes out to the needs of the company, what best fits, and they try and pick board members that fit. But what kind of thoughts do you have for the kind of committees that somebody should try and seek out? What kind of skill sets you need for each, what kind of things to avoid, and any advice for them on that?
I think as a first consideration when you join a board is get on the committee where you can add most value. You will want to quickly get to learn other board members, and others see the value you can bring to the company. And that's essentially, to the extent they hire you for certain skills and contributions, you should be able to return those to the company from the get-go. The second criteria for me has always been, how can I learn more about the company to make me a better board member? And that means delving into areas that I don't necessarily know well. So you can imagine coming out of government, with we won't go into what compensation and government work was like, but it's very different, both as qualitatively and quantitatively from what it is in the private sector. And learning that was important for me, and understanding what our compensation plans looked like, what were the components, why they were important, how they related to incentivizing certain objectives being attained, how shareholders viewed the relationship between compensation and performance. What I've done in a couple of other companies, Bill, you'll appreciate this, joined audit committees. There's no better way, in my opinion, to really understand how the company is doing, all the intricacies of its operations, than through the audit committee. It took me time to feel before I felt comfortable. I took some outside courses on finance on my own. I researched a lot. I was able in a couple of boards to sit in without being a charter member of the audit committee. Governance for me came pretty naturally and was fairly easy. It was sort of in my wheelhouse. Compensation now I feel pretty comfortable with. But I search out the challenges, and again, like a PG&E situation, I do believe it makes me a better board member and a better candidate for future boards. So those are the two criteria. Go to your strengths, contribute where you can help, because that's what you're there for, and then expand your horizons, learn as much as you can, which will make you an even better board member going forward.
Alex, I think that's a great message to end on. Thank you for your participation in our session. Bob, do you have any final comments you'd like to make?
Yes, thank you. That was very valuable insight as I think all the organizations that we're involved with over the course of the last 18 months have really come to appreciate that we have more stakeholders than we may realize. And we need to make sure that we're thinking broadly as we apply governance to our organization. So that's my kind of key takeaway from today. And so Alex and Bill, I thank you for the hour that we just spent or so gaining that insight. And to the audience, thank you for attending today. There will be a survey link that will be emailed to you following this event. And we really appreciate your feedback. Looking forward, please join us for our next event, which will be on Wednesday, November 10th, 2021, as we host The Future of Board Leadership, a symposium that will be conducted in person at the Fairmont Hotel. So be on the lookout in your emails for more information on this incredible annual event. If you haven't been to this, I would highly encourage your attendance. And also, our regular events that we will resume this fall. I certainly hope from our chapter to you that you have a safe and wonderful summer. And thank you for your continued support of the NACD Three Rivers chapter. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.